So swaps, as the name suggests, involve the exchange of something, right? So for our purposes of this course, the swaps that we'll be looking at involve essentially an exchange of cash flows, okay? There are many types of swaps. In fact, you even have deliverable futures for swaps, but we are going to confine ourselves to looking at simple swaps, which involves basically exchange of cash flows. So to exchange cash flows, you essentially have two parties, right? A and B, and for which A would pay the cash flows arising from the asset that A holds to B, and in exchange for that would receive the cash flows that B's assets is going to generate. Okay, so that's the basic principle of it. So we're going to look at three different types of swaps. First is equity. So let's say party A holds equity and party B holds, let's say, floating rate interest, fixed income instruments. Okay. Now, the first thing, there are a few things that you need to take note of in terms of swaps. So I'm going to describe them individually as applied to the three different categories of swaps. So the first one at equity. So the first thing you need to take note of is the asset, right? What asset does the two party holds? So in this case, for an equity swap, one party has to hold equity, and the other party can hold anything. It can be equity, it can be fixed interest, it can be whatever. But to qualify as an equity swap, one party has to be holding equity portfolio. Okay, it can be a stock, an index, or a portfolio. So one party holds equity, and let's say fixed income. So interest rate swaps So for interest rate swaps, both parties hold fixed income portfolio, right? To qualify as an interest rate swaps, one party has to hold floating rate instruments. So this is floating rate interest rates. The other party can hold floating rate or fixed rates. It doesn't matter. Okay? And the third swap that we're going to look at is currency swap. So let's say party A holds yen and party B holds, let's say, dollar. Okay? Now, in each of the case, the asset itself is not swapped. Only the cash flows are swapped. Okay? But for currency swap, the asset itself is swapped at the beginning of the swap period. So if party A holds yen and party B holds dollar, then party A is going to give up the yen and party B is going to give up the dollar at the beginning of the swap period at whatever exchange rate, let's say 120, let's say 1. Okay? Now at the end of the swap period, they're going to swap back the currency. So party B is going to give back the yen and party A is going to receive back the dollar. Okay, so at the beginning of the period, party A gives up the yen to party B. At the end of the swap period, receives back the same yen from party B. So there is no exchange rate risk involved in a currency swap. So if they exchange at 1 to 120, then that's the same rate that they're going to receive back at the end of the swap. Okay? Now for equity swap and interest rate swap, there is no exchange of asset. It's only the cash flows that changes hands. So that's asset for you. And of course then you have to look at the cash flows, right? Because it's an exchange of cash flows. So what is the cash flow for equity swap? What is the cash flow for equity? Dividend, right? What else? Plus capital gain. Okay? And the cash flows for fixed income would simply be the interest rate, the floating interest rates in this case. Okay? And the cash flows for interest rate swap would simply be floating and fixed interest rates. Okay? So this is this way. Now the cash flows for a currency swap, however, is what? What is the cash flow from currency deposits?
Okay, between domestic and
So it's again interest rates, right, on the currency involved. Now notice that for an equity swap, the party that holds equity pays out cash flows arising from equity. In an interest rate swap, the party that holds floating rates pays out the interest for floating rates. Now in a currency swap, the party who holds yen do not pay out the cash flows arising from yen. Instead, he pays out the cash flows arising from dollar. So take note of this. In a currency swap, you pay out the cash flows based on the currency that you receive. In which case, this is the dollar for the yen party. Is that clear to all? Okay, there are distinct differences between the three swaps. Aside from that, the calculation should be quite simple. So my intention here is to help you to distinguish the differences between the three swaps, and with that you can do the calculation much easier later on. So the third thing you need to look at is, of course, the direction of payment, right? Now, in an equity swap, if party A pays cash flows arising from equity, well, in most instances, a swap arrangement involves two directional, right? If I pay you the cash flows from the asset that I receive, I will receive the cash flows from the asset that you receive. Okay? So it's two directional. Now, in the case of an equity swap, it can be only one direction. Now, the reason for that is because the cash flows that arise from an equity can be negative, right? Because you don't necessarily make a capital gain, you could make a capital loss, right? So what it means is if I'm holding an equity portfolio, I'll pass on whatever gain or loss from my equity portfolio to you. So if I make a gain, I'll be paying you. If I make a loss, I'm going to pass the loss to you as well. So it becomes a negative payment, right? So as a result of that, you find that for an equity swap, the direction of payment can sometimes be only one direction. So if this becomes a loss, then you won't be paying party B anything, but party B would pay you back a loss as well. Okay, so we'll see that in a calculation example. Now for the other two swaps, the direction is two directional. Any questions so far? Okay, then we need to look at netting. Okay, now if party A were to pay party B, let's say 10 million from cash flows from equity, and party B is to pay 5 million, so there is a netting. Instead of paying you 10 million and receiving 5 million, I'll simply pay you 5 million. Okay, so that's the netting effect. So the same principle applies to interest rate swaps. However, in the case of a currency swap, you cannot do a netting, right? Because the cash flows are in different currency. Okay, so of course you cannot do a net off effect in the payment. All right. Now the other thing that you need to consider is, of course, the principal. Now principal again does not normally change. So if you start off with, let's say, 100 million cash flows arising from 100 million equity in exchange for cash flows arising from 100 million fixed income. Now, the same with interest rate swap and currency swap, the principle doesn't change. Okay. Now that makes sense, right? Because if you're going to exchange the currency at the beginning of the swap period and take back the same currency at the end of the swap period, then the principle does not change. Now for the same reason, the current interest rate swaps principle will not change as well. However, in the case of an equity swap, the principle can change in the course of your swap period. Why is that so? Now the reason for that is quite simple, right? Because if I start off with 100 million equity, throughout the swap period, my 100 million changes, right? Because I could make a capital gain, I could make a capital loss. So at different points in time, it is no longer 100 million but something else. It could be more, it could be less, right? Now, in the case of a fixed income portfolio for party B, the cash flows is simply coupons, right? So the principal will not change. So therefore, there arises a situation whereby you can find that, well, if we start off with saying that you pay me based on 100 million equity and I pay you 100 million fixed income, now your equity is only worth, let's say, 75 million. So it's no longer a fair exchange, right? So as a result of that, you find that there are situations whereby the principal can change. So at different points in time, you would need to adjust for the principal. Okay? Is that clear? Yes? Okay, so the final thing we need to consider is, of course, time. So swap period may be quarterly, it may be half yearly, or it may be annual, whatever the time frame you agreed upon, right? So it is important to remember the time frame as well, because in the case of cash flows arising from interest payments, you find that interest rates are always quoted on an annual basis, right? So you have to apportion your cash flows. Okay? Is that clear to all? Any questions on the principles behind it? Okay, we're done with swaps. So what remains is basically the calculations, which will be fairly simple. Okay, the important thing with swap is that you need to understand the setup of the swaps and the difference between the three categories of swaps. Okay. Any question? There are distinct differences, right? For example, the asset changes hands for one of them. The asset principal value can change for another one. Right? So there are distinct differences that you need to take note of, so that when you do your calculations, you're conscious of that. Questions? No? Okay, good. So the three popular types of swaps that we are looking at in this course are equity interest rates and currency, as I've just described. Now, these are called plain vanilla swaps, just like the options that you studied at the beginning of the course. Not your exotic options, but from topics 1 to 5. So those are called plain vanilla options. These are called plain vanilla swaps, simply because they're the basic types of instruments, right? It's like you walk into Macca's and you buy what's the ice cream that you see people carrying all the time, the white one? What do you call that? No flavor? Soft serve? Yeah. So you could buy a soft serve, right? That's plain vanilla. Or you could buy something more exotic with chocolate in it, strawberries in it, and something more exotic, right? So those called more exotic, and we have exotic instruments. If you buy a soft serve, then that's just plain vanilla. So that's the distinction between plain vanilla instruments and exotic instruments. Okay, so swaps are generally OTCs. I hope you still remember the difference between OTCs and exchange-traded contracts in terms of the risk involved, right? You have credit risk, you have default risk, and so on and so forth. So with swaps, they are mostly OTCs, and as a result of that, you also have similar kind of risk. So institutional investors are typically the people involved in them, and how do you get into a swap arrangement? Well, it's typically arranged by big brokerage houses, merchant banks, investment banks. So what they do is they function in two capacities in general. One is as a broker, the other one as a swap dealer. Okay, as a broker, what they do is they simply put two parties together in a swap arrangement and they earn a commission from that. Now, as a swap dealer, I would then take the opposite position from you. If you want to engage in a swap, I'll take the opposite position from you, and then I'll turn around and hedge that by taking the opposite position with another party. And in the process, I'll try and earn a spread. Okay, so a broker and a dealer functions quite differently. So we'll look at some calculations for an equity swap. So suppose the portfolio manager wants to buy the ASX 200. Now before I do that, based on the description that I gave you on the document camera about swaps, can you then see that you have essentially created a synthetic instrument? We talk about synthetic instruments, right? In the beginning of the course, how we could create synthetic instruments by means of put-call parity, by means of option strategies. So similarly, a swap essentially creates for you a synthetic instrument. Look at this. If a portfolio manager wants to buy equity, right, but he or she doesn't want to actually put money into equity, he can simply engage in a swap arrangement, right? So by paying out the fixed income that he doesn't want and receive the cash flows for the equity that he wants, instead of actually buying into equity. Can you see the distinction? So as a result of that, you essentially have created a synthetic instruments by which you can participate in the returns of some instrument without actually investing in it. Right? Now there are distinct advantages in doing so, because if I were to buy into equity, I have to incur transaction costs, right? And I have to sell off my fixed income portfolio to get the money. Now by engaging in a swap, I don't have to do any of that, and at the same time, I achieve my objective of enjoying the returns of equity that I want. Okay? So this portfolio manager holds a fixed income portfolio, and she is going to pay LIBOR, which is the cash flows from the fixed income portfolio, in return for an equity returns. So these are quarterly payments, right? Now you could be given a table like this with some blanks, and then you just fill up the blanks. So you could be asked to calculate interest rate, you could be calculate some returns, any which way, right? So these are quarterly payments, interest rates, and the equity returns. So remember, when you calculate returns for fixed income portfolio, you always use the preceding period's interest rates. Okay? Because this is 1 quarter, right? January to April. So January to April, your fixed income portfolio's return is based on 4.5%. 4.75% is going to be applied for the second period. So you always use the preceding period's interest rate to calculate your returns. And always remember, interest rate is quoted annually, so you have to apportion. Okay? So in this case, the equity returns have been calculated for you, but it's also simple for you to calculate. You simply take the price at t plus 1 minus t over t, right? You get your returns here. So how do you get the payment? Well, 191,000 is simply 17 million times 4.5% for the period. Okay, apportion for the period. And 639 is simply 17 million times 3.76%. Okay? Now remember, you do not have to apportion for your equity returns because the equity returns is at a point in time. Okay? Whereas the interest rate is accrued over a period of time. Okay? So the net effect is 447,000, right? So the portfolio manager pays out 191,000, receives 639,000, so the net effect is he receives 447,000. Now these are the two payments that I want you to pay attention to. So you find that equity makes a loss in the second period. Okay, so the portfolio manager still pays out the cash flows from her portfolio of 204,000, but because the equity has suffered a loss, he no longer gets to receive the revenue or the income from the equity portfolio. Okay, so instead he has to take the loss of this So this becomes 565 negative. So this is what I mean when I say the direction of the cash flows can be one direction only, because in this case, you don't pay out 204 and receive 361, you actually suffer a 361,000 loss. Okay, so this becomes negative. So of course, this benefits the equity portfolio manager, right? Now, in the third instance, it's also a negative, but the negative is not due to a loss on the equity portfolio. It's simply due to the netting effect. Okay, he pays out 184, receives 173, so it's just a minus 10. Okay? Any question on the calculation? Okay, benefits from equity swaps. Well, they allow easy exchange among asset classes. So what it means is that there are several advantages. For one, if you engage in an equity swap, essentially you have not given up your equity portfolio, right? You're still holding on to your portfolio and you simply give up the cash flows that arise from it. So as a result of that, you find that you retain things like voting rights. Because sometimes if you're a portfolio manager, you want voting rights in the stocks that you're invested in. Okay, so that allows you to continue to hold on to your voting rights. Now they can also be used to achieve better diversification. So for example, if I have a situation here that let's say I have Forex, equity and fixed income. Let's say this is my portfolio, okay, and I have, let's say 20 or maybe 40, 40, 20, right? This is my constitution of the portfolio. Now, if I don't want 40 because I think that this is going to be working against me, and I want to achieve only 20 and 20 here. Okay, so what do I have to do? And 40 here, sorry. So this is existing. This is desired. This is what I want. From 40-20 to 40-20-40, what kind of swap arrangement can I work out on to diversify my portfolio? Do I want to pay equity or do I want to receive equity? What do you think, ma'am? Pay or receive equity? Pay equity. Does everyone agree? Yes, right? Because if I don't want equity, I give up my equity, right? So I enter into a swap arrangement whereby I agree to give up 20% of my equity, and in return, I receive 20 fixed income equity, right? So that way, I continue to retain my voting rights and everything that's associated with my original portfolio, the only difference being the cash flows that arise from it. Okay, next we look at interest rate swaps. So party A and party B again, while party A pays fixed and party B pays floating. Again, this qualifies as an interest rate swap because one party is floating. Okay, so fixed rates at 9%, LIBOR at how many percent? 8.75%. So, excuse me, so this is paid over 6 months period. So of course, fixed interest rates is 9% times 50 million divided by 2. LIBOR rate is at 8.75. Remember, it has to it's an annual rate, so again you have to apportion. Okay. So pay fixed pays 2.25 and 2.185. So this is basically 9% times 50 million divided by 2. This is basically 8.75 times 50 million divided by 2. Difference of 62,500 netting off. Okay? Any question? Okay, why do we use interest rate swaps? Well, there are a number of reasons. Now, even at a personal level, you probably could think of that and find that it applies to you, although on a theoretical basis, because swaps are big numbers, right? So if you have a housing loan, it's probably not big enough to be engaged in a swap. Okay, but the principle is there. Okay, so for example, if you have a liability such as a housing loan or some other liability that is based on fixed interest rates, and you find that interest rates are falling, so you stand to lose, right? You can then enter into a swap arrangement for which you pay fixed, right? And you receive variable, right? Wrong. If you do that, you're paying fixed 2 times, right? So if my liability now is to pay fixed interest rates, of course I want to receive fixed interest rate and pay floating rate, right? So that by receiving fixed, it cancels out my original payment of fixed, right? Okay, you have to get that right. Okay, I'll repeat that. If my liability now is to pay fixed, and I don't want that, right? Do I want to enter into arrangement to pay fixed again? I don't, right? Because then I'm paying fixed 2 times. So of course I want to enter an arrangement to receive fixed so that this cancels out with this, and in return I pay variable, okay? That's a common mistake, okay? So take note of that. Okay, so there are a number of things you can do. You can also use that to exploit market inefficiencies, restructure your debt mix in a similar manner to what I showed you for restructuring your portfolio in the case of an equity swap. So these are basically gap management, right? Balance sheet. So this has to do with duration, which you would study in your fixed income. Or you would have studied in your fixed income, right? Because fixed income is a prereq. So next we move on to currency swap. Okay, so each party will then pay interest on the currency that it receives. So it's very important that you remember the beginning of the lecture, all the differences between the swaps, okay? Because in some swap you pay out the cash flows from the asset that you own. In a currency swap you pay out on the asset that you receive. Okay, so remember all of those differences. Okay, so calculation. So at the beginning of the swap period, the Japanese firm pays out yen, okay, at an exchange rate of 1 to 120, and the Australian firm pays out 10 million. So if you look at one party, what it means is that the Japanese firm pays out 1.2 billion yen and receives $10 million. Now at the end of the period, he returns the 10 million which he received at the beginning, and he received back his 1.2 billion yen. Okay, so there's no forex risk involved. So during the swap period, however, he would pay interest based on the dollar, the currency that he receives, and not on the yen. Okay. So simply take the interest rate times the principal over the period involved. Any question on the calculation? So if you were given a value here and a value here, you can calculate what is the interest rate, right? Okay. Any question on calculations? You okay with that? Anyone not comfortable with the calculations? Okay, good. So in a swap exercise, you could be given a table like what you've seen in the calculations, or you could be given a diagram like this. So by convention, this is what you upward arrow indicates receipt, downward arrow indicates payment. So whose perspective is this? Is this the yen party or the dollar party's diagram? Upward movement indicates receipt, downward movement arrow indicates payment. So whose perspective is this, the dollar party or the yen party? Dollar? Yen? Dollar or yen? Can't hear you. Dollar, buddy. Very good. Looks like you grabbed swaps just like that. Okay, so I've described all of this at the beginning. Okay, so why do we enter currency swaps? There are again distinct advantages for currency swaps. One of which is that there can be situations for which I have no access to a certain currency, right? So if I want to be invested in, let's say, China, for example, I may not have access to the Chinese currency as easily as you as a local, right? So I can always enter into a swap arrangement with you for which you give me the Chinese currency, I give you the dollar, right? So we swap for that. So that kind of circumvent the situation, because then I have overcome my difficulty in securing the foreign funds that I want, okay? Now, the same case can apply to equity too, because if I want to be invested in, let's say, Korean equity. Now, as a foreigner, I may not have access to that as easily as a Korean, right? So again, I could also structure a swap arrangement such that it allows me to enjoy Korean equity returns, okay? So these are practical considerations that you want to take note of as to why people engage in swaps, which is also the reason why you find that swaps are mainly engaged by big players or big houses and not at the retail level, okay? So we look at one type of so-called exotic swaps. Okay, so what we've seen so far are all plain vanilla. So this is a circus swap. So a circus here means it's a combined interest rate and currency swap. So how do you achieve this? Well, you can enter into a plain vanilla interest rate swap for which you pay fixed and you receive LIBOR, which means you receive floating rate, okay? And you enter into another swap arrangement with a different party for which you pay LIBOR and you receive pounds. So what happens is, in effect, the LIBOR and the LIBOR cancels out. So what you've left with is that you pay fixed and you receive fixed, but in different currencies. So effectively, you've converted that into a currency swap, okay? Any question? Okay, can you read the text slides on your own? I will talk about that when we talk about the exam in a minute, okay? Do you need to take a break? Can we continue? Okay, good.